one of my favorite leadership principles is ask questions instead of giving direct orders. I mean, you're nodding your head, right? I mean,
I
it
love
makes
that.
1,000% of sense
Yeah.
because, anybody that has a leader and, it's unless you're in the heat of battle and you're in the Marines and bullets are flying over your head, there is time to say, okay, this happened. How could we have done this differently?
Yep.
What can we do together to fix this? Instead, I know I might have been in this industry for 30 years. I know exactly what we should do, but I'm not, going to just say, okay, do this, do that. That's going to erode trust.
Welcome to Leadership Rewired with Allison Allen, the podcast where we cut through the noise and talk about what leading really takes. No sugarcoating, no jargon, just real conversations, hard-earned insights, and practical wisdom to help you lead through change. Build the cultures that work and stay human while doing it. Let's get into it. Welcome to Leadership Rewired. Today, I am joined by Ken Fogarty. He is the CEO of Dale Carnegie of Nevada, part of a global organization that's shaping leaders for now over a century. Ken is a decorated U.S. Navy veteran, a former executive with IBM and Merck, and a master facilitator in human connection. What makes this conversation so special is Ken's perspective on leadership through time, from Shackleton's expedition and the Great Depression to today's post-pandemic AI-driven world. We're going to talk about what timeless leadership really looks like, the kind that builds trust in chaos, connection in hybrid teams, and humanity in an increasingly digital world.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Oh, so nice to have you here. You've mentioned Shackleton and the Great Depression as examples of leadership under pressure. What do
Yes.
these moments teach us about resilience and trust that still apply today?
So thank you for bringing that up. And I love starting with that because I'm a bit of a history buff. I know a lot of folks are, and I really appreciate reading history and the fact that, as the cliche goes, history repeats itself. And so we can learn a lot about what's going on today from history. I am very honored to be part of the Dale Carnegie organization. As you mentioned, the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, one of the best-selling business books and human relations books of all time, was written in 1936. So this was, we're going to get back to that in a second. But if you think about that time and even before, so going back to the early 1900s, 1914 to be exact, you brought it up. Ernest Shackleton had his famous expedition to the South Pole. And we don't have enough time to really dive into the details of the story, but it was a fantastic story where he brought 27 men, got stranded for 2 years in the Antarctic, and basically made it back with all 27. During that time, there was empathetic leadership displayed, crisis navigation, and a human first approach that allowed him to bring everyone back safely, which, at that time, other expeditions failed tragically and terribly. And there's been many case studies about that to look at what he did, and we can connect that to the present time. Dale Carnegie's book, I mentioned, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Again, it's, the seminal books, and obviously one of the books is very important to us as an organization. Dale Carnegie moved to New York City in 1922, and his book came out in 1936. Now, I always talk about this. If you think about New York City and frankly, the country, the world, in that time frame, the stock market crashed in October 1929. He is writing this book. He is teaching adult classes. He is teaching people how to win friends and influence people through this very traumatic time in our history. In 1936, we're still in the grips of the Great Depression, where we haven't come out of it as a country. Democrats are blaming Republicans for the run on banks. Republicans are blaming Democrats for different aspects. There's tariff acts that aren't working, and sounds familiar, right? And so ultimately, there's a lot of division in the country. But here comes this book after decades of research and discussion and development of human relations principles that helped millions of people and continues to help millions of people today. So, ultimately, to wrap up this little bit, I can look at history and I can see these examples, and there's many others, but I can see these examples. And what I'm going to talk a lot about in this podcast with you today is principles, right? Human principles that came out then, that were used then, that we can directly tie to what we need as a humanity, as a country, as a world today.
Double click for me on human connection, because I think you made such a strong tie between the past and present, and you almost were describing what is happening today, right? But double click on the words human connection. I think that would be super helpful for people.
Sure. I give talks all the time. I gave literally 3 talks yesterday. It's one of my passions, and I love talking to different groups. I was talking to a group of salespeople yesterday, commercial real estate salespeople. The interesting thing is that's their profession. Their profession is sales, and their profession is deeply rooted in human connection because people buy from people they know and trust. And there are principles that I believe get overlooked, human relations principles that get overlooked, that people, look at it and say, well, common sense. I'm not going to focus on that. I think these salespeople today are looking for this really eloquent way to make people come their way, choose their product. But this one individual I was talking to, I introduced myself and he introduced himself, and he had a very common name, but even the way he said his name was so quick, he couldn't wait to get the words out of his mouth. And, being the Dale Carnegie person, I'm very focused on names. So I asked him, what was your name again? And I had to literally ask him again because he just blurted it out. I'll use my name as an example, Ken Fogarty, right? Like if I just say Ken Fogarty, like, do you really know it's Ken Fogarty?
Right.
And what we see in our Dale Carnegie classes all the time is human connection is built on the basics, right?
Yeah.
Built on what is your name? Where do you live? What is your human experience? Let me listen to you. Let me pull that into myself and let my synapses rest on that. And that's where trust begins. And it seems simplistic. These things are common sense, but not necessarily common practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want people to have that common element, to really focus on these basics of human connection. And that's where the foundation gets built. So hopefully that answered.
Dale Carnegie's early work helped stabilize people during the chaos, right? How do you see that translation to modern sort of uncertainty that's happening today?
So there's another book that I'm going to reference here. It's actually a gentleman that I know and I'm very fond of. Joe Corleone wrote a book called The Touchstones of Leadership. As I'm reading it, I'm thinking about the Dale Carnegie books. I'm thinking about the John Maxwell books. So there's obviously kind of similar things here. But one of the quotes that Joe has is one of my favorite new quotes, but I'm going to use it probably forever. And that is, here's the quote: "Let your principles, not the circumstance, guide your behavior." Right? So let your principles guide your behavior, not the circumstance. And so I think about that, and I think about Shackleton. Talk about an extreme circumstance, right? Where our ship is sunk. We're in the Antarctic. What are we going to do? And he did not dispense with his principles. He stayed true to his principles. So when you think about today and the chaos and the diversion that's happening in our world, if we dispense with these human relations principles and we just go with our gut and just blurt things out, trust is going to break down. And trust, people follow trust. People don't follow titles. Just because, I have a certain title or you have a certain title, if we just let our principles go upon chaos, then, we're going to lose. Let your principles, not the circumstance, guide your behavior.
Well, first of all, I love that quote, but in the spirit of being a little bit grounded in what I would suspect most of the listeners are saying, that's easier said than done. You're in the middle of a layoff and your managers come down and told you that you have to lay off half your team. No reason, no data, no information. You are being asked to fire someone that you don't believe you should be firing. You are forcing people who are top performers to come back. And I mean, there's just like, look at what's the news. When that hits you, when that statement hits you or that request hits you, sometimes it's a little bit hard to sort of keep yourself grounded in principle. Like, what would you say to someone who says that to you?
Well, I have a lot to say about that, and I'll try to keep it short. But ultimately, that's the reason Dale Carnegie as an organization is in business. And that's the reason why Stephen Covey and the 7 Habits people are in business. This is common sense, but not common practice.
Right.
What I would say to people is none of this is easy, right? And it really, if it was easy, we would all be connecting and communicating and there would be, not as much division in the world. It's not easy. One of the more difficult things that we teach in our courses is a section called Disagree Agreeably. That in and of itself probably describes what it is. And we coach on that, but that's one of the more difficult things in our classes. But I'm going to read one of our principles. And so there's 30 human relations principles that come from the famous book. When I give my talks, I have everyone look at the principles and I say, I'm going to read principle number 4 and I'm going to leave out a word. And so here's the principle without the word. And it is become interested in other people. That's principle number 4. But now I'm going to read the full thing. Become genuinely interested in other people. And so you can say, sure, I could become interested in other people, but let me ask you a question. Can you become genuinely interested in other people? And so, I can walk down the road and say, hey, how are you? Where are you from? But to have that in you and your DNA to become genuinely interested in other people, that one key word is the linchpin. So it takes effort. It takes practice. I mean, when I do coaching, and it sounds silly, but it's a common. I say, stand in front of the mirror, right, and talk to your reflection as if you're talking to somebody, and practice human connection and genuine connection. There's another one. It's number 17 in Dale Carnegie's principles is try to see things from the other person's point of view. Okay, it's pretty common, but I left out a word, and the word I left out is honestly. Try honestly to see things from the other person's perspective. So, I could give people the golden book, which we hand out to people that has all the human relations principles in it. And I can say, follow those principles. And they could say, great, I will. But, it's not as simple as that. You have to practice these things. You have to get this into your DNA so that when these circumstances come up, when you have to fire somebody, when you have to have a tough discussion with somebody, either upwards or downwards in your organization, then you have it in you. But it takes coaching, it takes a course, it takes reading and really embracing these principles.
I like the example of leaving the word out and how more powerful it becomes when you add the additional word. Honestly, genuinely, those are words that aspire, or is it aspire? Inspire energy, right? When you add those words, now all of a sudden it feels like something I really need to proactively, actively think about and do. It almost makes it not as easy to accomplish, right? Because to your point, you can walk down the street speaking to everyone, but are you genuinely interested in those folks? And if you are, how do you demonstrate that in that moment? You talk about rebuilding connection and accountability in a distracted hybrid workplace. What's one thing leaders are getting wrong about human connection right now? What are they missing?
So another story from my experience, and this is about 5 hours ago. I was at a breakfast networking meeting here in Henderson, Nevada, and it was actually a very, CEOs, CFOs, higher in the organization individuals, and somebody was in a panel, and somebody was asked how they survey their team members. And this individual, extremely smart, very confident, no ums and no likes and like, I mean, it was a direct answer. But he spoke, and I timed it because I was kind of, in this moment of thinking about this, I looked at my watch, my phone, and he spoke for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. That's how long it took him to answer that question. And, being the Dale Carnegie person I am, I was listening to the content very carefully. He could have answered that question in about a minute, very effectively, and it would have hit home. It would have been really impactful if he, took that amount of time, answered the question in a very direct, communicative way, but instead he succumbed to our human nature. And our human nature says, the more you talk, the more the person is going to be influenced. If I keep talking, if I keep going, then people are going to agree with me, which is exactly the opposite of what is true, right? And so, he's talking and he's answering this quite simple, direct question, and I'm timing him. My Dale Carnegie gears are going, and I also am glancing around the room, and about 3 minutes in, people are checking their phones. They're checked out. They're not listening anymore. And so, I'm answering your question in kind of an indirect way, but what I think is people are succumbing to human nature, and they're not focusing on the basics. So I apologize for being redundant, but I think that these basic principles of communication are what is effective for humans. And maybe it's a post-COVID thing. Maybe it's because we're living in the AI world thing. Or maybe it's just in our DNA to want to talk and talk and talk. Maybe it's just in our human nature to do that. But it is proven scientifically that we have something called the magic formula in Dale Carnegie, that if you're talking more than a minute and 50 seconds, your receiver is checking out. So if you're talking to somebody, we call it the magic formula. If you're talking to somebody, and to answer your question a little bit more directly, if I'm a leader and I want to prove a point, if I'm a manager and I need to talk to my boss about something that's going on, if I just kind of go on and on, they're going to check out, and that whole thing, that whole topic will be lost. So we need to focus on these basics of communication, because that's what's going to get our point across, which is going to build trust, which is going to reduce stress, which is going to improve our effectiveness as a communicator.
Yeah, it's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking to myself, I can remember speaking to my team and thinking the additional color was necessary. Because you're looking around the room and you're trying to read some faces, and you're trying, like, some people get it and they're like, okay, I got it. Some people are sort of somewhat confused, and you're trying to aim toward the entire audience, right? You're trying to get as many people in. And I think that actually is the problem, because that's actually what's causing you, I think, to give the additional color. Plus, you may or may not believe in what you're actually saying. I love the frame around a minute and 50 seconds. That's pretty specific. Like, how, a little bit of color on that.
Sure, absolutely. So what we introduce very early in our class is called the magic formula. And the magic formula is 1 minute and 50 seconds of incident, or, action, or, not action, sorry, incident. I'll leave it at that. There's different words for it. But 1 minute and 50 seconds of the story. Then 10 seconds or less of what is the action that we want you to take from this story, and what is the benefit. 10 seconds on benefit. So it's 1 minute and 50, I'll call it 5 seconds for the action, 5 seconds for the benefit.
Mm-hmm.
We have probably about 8 opportunities for participants to come up in front of our cohorts and speak on different topics, on leadership, on stress reduction. But we require them to talk within the boundaries of the magic formula. We, as instructors, we hold our phone and we say 10 seconds, because we are coaching brevity. We are coaching consistency. We're coaching for the ability to communicate within this window, because we're coaching to avoid people going long. And now you may say, okay, well, I have to give a presentation. It's going to be more than 2 minutes. I have to talk about all these different things. But that still applies, because if you think about that, if you break it down into that, time frames, like 10 of those, then you can, do your 2 minutes, minute 50, and then stop. And then, okay, what questions do we have? Can I keep going? Let me reframe and go on to this next one. It doesn't matter. I don't care if you're listening to the CEO or if you're just listening to your coworker in the lunchroom. Once that 3-minute mark hits, they're gone. Unless it's something deeply intrinsic to what they're interested in, your message is being lost. So we teach very heavily what is called the magic formula. If you can stay within the boundaries there, you're going to really be a much more effective communicator.
When you think about today, post-pandemic, AI-driven world, layoffs, many leaders are struggling to rebuild trust with their teams and the people that they lead. What do you see as the new baseline of trust in today's organizations?
So there are, as I mentioned, 30 human relations principles. So 1 through 9 is how to have people like you. 10 through 21 is how to influence people. And then 22 through 30 are the be a leader principles, right? And so there are principles, begin with praise and honest appreciation. So there's another, word we could leave out. We could leave out the word honest at first, right? Begin with praise and appreciation. Begin with praise and honest appreciation. So we want to do that. Things like call attention to people's mistakes indirectly. Talk about your own mistakes before criticizing other people. One of my favorite leadership principles is ask questions instead of giving direct orders. I mean, you're nodding your head, right? I mean, it makes 1,000% of sense, because anybody that has a leader, and it's, unless you're in the heat of battle and you're in the Marines and bullets are flying over your head, there is time to say, okay, this happened. How could we have done this differently? What can we do together to fix this? Instead, I know I might have been in this industry for 30 years. I know exactly what we should do, but I'm not, going to just say, okay, do this, do that. That's going to erode trust. I could go on. There's number, and forgive me because they're all numbered, right? So I have to memorize these numbers. But number 28, give the person a fine reputation to live up to. If you are, in a public forum or, internally in a meeting or something like that, if I said, talked to Allison last week and Allison really came through. Not only did she get that done, she got it done early. And I had to tell you, if you want something done, go talk to Allison, right? And that's it. And so I'm giving you a fine reputation to live up to. And it's kind of old-timey talk, right? Because this was written in 1936, but it absolutely applies today. So again, in the interest of redundancy and talking about these principles, to answer your question, there are basic things that we can do as long as we study them and really embrace them and be honest about them. There's no mystical answer, right? I mean, we're all different human beings. I was born in New Jersey. I know you're from the East Coast, but there's people from around the world. My wife is from Brazil, and there's different approaches to things. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a base trust that needs to exist between people for true leadership to come out. And that begins in basic trust and doing these types of things.
So first of all, you don't have to apologize for repeating the principles. I think that's kind of the point, especially of this podcast today. I think you haven't said a principle that I think would, people would go, oh my God, that's crazy. I could never do that. The way in which you are explaining them are, really grounded and just, making sure that people understand. So please don't mind you repeating and don't mind you bringing them up, because that's kind of the point, which kind of brings me to my next question, which is Dale Carnegie's principles are considered timeless. Mm-hmm. Yet a lot of folks may not know how to apply them to modern realities. And I just want to go deeper here, because I think we're in this time where leaders are probably dealing with things that I never dealt with in my early career or even in my mid-career. So when you think about timeless principles meeting modern day realities, we can fill that in: AI, remote work, political injustice or justice, depending on what side you're on, burnout, layoffs, not knowing when the next shoe is going to drop. How do these principles meet today?
Mm-hmm. So there's, I mentioned it before, disagree agreeably, right? So I'm actually going to get away from the principles for a second to answer your question. And I mentioned before John Maxwell. So John Maxwell is a name in the leadership. He's written many books. Interestingly enough, John Maxwell was inspired by Dale Carnegie, and he says that openly, right? He talks about Dale Carnegie as being one of his mentors. So those principles kind of carry on. He's written different books about different things. So, he has his own kind of principles, but it's more of a narrative, if you will. That, I'm sitting here from the Dale Carnegie perspective. It's do 12 and do 16, where John Maxwell will say, okay, let's have like more of a conversational aspect to it. A lot of the things that are in our curriculum are like the disagree agreeably, right? And so we talk about how to disagree. We also talk very heavily about evidence. Evidence is an incredibly powerful thing, and we use it in our course a lot. So if you disagree with somebody, we'll take two sides of this. So the first is disagree. So if I disagree with somebody, again, it sounds common sense, but it's very hard to get this into your practicum. And that is, you pause, right? Somebody says something, your wife's cooking sucks, right? So you pause, right? And so you don't react, or, obviously whatever the comment is, you don't react right away. You pause and you give it a moment of silence and you use a cushion. And so my favorite cushion is, I understand what you're saying, right? That's my cushion. And so there's others, but that's the one I have in my head. And that's the one I use. Certainly I'm guilty sometimes of veering away from this, but this is what you should do. And you never use words like but, because Allison, what happens when you say but?
Everything before it doesn't matter.
You're basically saying you're wrong, right? And exactly. So you never use the word but. So we coach people on this. And like I said earlier in our discussion, this is one of the harder things that we teach, because it's in our heads, right? But and you want to react. So it's one of the things we really coach on. And so we pause and we cushion statement, but then we use evidence, right? And so evidence defeats doubt. That's one of the Dale Carnegie comments. Evidence defeats doubt. And so if I have, some evidence, and sorry, my phone. If there's evidence that I have, I can say, well, I understand your position. What I have seen in my experience is this, this, and this. And so here's the evidence, here's the statistics. I know statistics can be, kind of massaged in different ways, but if you have something hard and fast, you can use that. Examples, in my history, I've seen this. So we also use evidence in what we call our strength-centered compliments. So the other side of it, not a disagreement, but an agreement, but also a compliment. What we coach in our training is that I'll give you a strength-centered compliment. Allison, I love the way that you're approaching leadership. The fact that you're reaching out to business leaders like myself and taking the initiative to create these podcasts is really going to be a help for humanity. And I appreciate that. And I know others are going to appreciate that as well. So that is, first off, true. So kudos to you. But secondly, it's what we call a strength-centered compliment, right? Mm-hmm. Not just good job. It's not just, hey, awesome, right? I mean, that's fine. If you're walking down the hall, your leader says, hey, great job, high five. But that's gone, right? It's like a leaf blowing in the wind. It was here and now it's gone. But if you use evidence, both in disagreements and agreements, then these things are going to resonate. And so, you mentioned AI, right? I mean, so everyone in the world is now the smartest person in the world. I have 3 monitors here. I could pull up any fact. I could answer any question that you could give me, right? And so we're in an age of, if you don't come back with something solid, then it really loses meaning, because now we're in a world of responses. I love this evidence defeats doubt. And, it doesn't have to be some Einstein kind of fact or figure or whatever. It's just what you're seeing. And if you say it to the person, it resonates more.
I think the thing that I would just double click on the AI point. I think the thing around AI that's got a lot of leaders really tripped up is really around this notion of knowing that a lot of the AI implementation organizations today are all about displacing people. And it's about this knowing of jobs will be taken as a result of AI, and that fear that leaders have knowing that they know that and can't always be honest, and the fear that the people who work for them know. And again, how do you bring calm? And I'll go back and I'll say your pause, your cushion, and your evidence is a good way to frame that sort of setting for people.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, there's a lot of thoughts I have about that. And I will, so principle number 12, if you are wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. So that's principle number 12. And I love that one because I'm just a dumb kid from New Jersey, right? And so it's really, over the span of my career, I've had foibles too many to count, right? And so, I'm 56. So there's a lot of learnings that have come along the way. Yeah. But I know that you are an East Coaster, from some of your time, and as I am, and you and I both lived in New York City for a period of time. And I know that we share that. And my mother, rest her soul, used to say, to me, you got to slow down. Like, I walk and I talk and I do everything way, way too fast. And she actually had hearing problems, and her own son, she couldn't even gather because I was just talking so fast. And I don't know if that's an East Coast thing or what, but I just have that in me. And so one of the first things that we talked about on this podcast was me meeting that gentleman, and he couldn't wait to get his name out of his mouth. Right. And so I do think that that's kind of a human nature thing. It's almost like, if you can't answer fast enough, if you can't talk fast enough, then you don't know what you're talking about. Right. And so, but I ask my course participants, and I will ask you, and not to, rhetorical question, you don't have to answer it, but if we think about the best leaders that we know, right, I'm not going to even say names for fear of kind of leaning one way or another, but, if you think about the best people we know, and you think about how they talk, and you think about how thoughtful they are not just blurting out 1,000 miles an hour, right? They are thoughtful. They're stopping, they're considering, and they're answering. And so I think one of these very, subtext side products of this AI world, you mentioned, speed, right?
Yep.
So sure. I mean, if I can get my accounting system done quicker, great. I mean, that's awesome. But when it comes to human relations, I need to be thoughtful because that's where trust gets built. And so it's a struggle for me as a New Jersey born, New York bred guy that just wants to blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, if we think about these people that are most effective and we try to model them, they are using pauses, they are using cushions, they are being thoughtful, and that's going to build trust. And I believe that that's where we need to be as a society today. We need to look up from the AI and have the leader stand there and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
AI says this, fine, but we as an organization, this is the principles we exhibit, this is our goals. How are we going to get them?
And there's so much in what you said, but I'll tag on to the last part, which is, how do you do the work that you're being asked to do and do it first in your own principles, but also in the principles of your organization, which is what you just said. So excuse me, I'll go back to like McKinsey, which is, one of their guiding principles is, you're obligated to dissent, right? Which I love and live by to this day. But, how do you continue to dissent or allow people to dissent if you're a leader that knows that again, are rolling out something that could potentially impact people's jobs? And I think it's, again, if you're looking at the work that you're doing in an organization through your own principles, but also the principle of the organization, that will cause you to have a more of a foundation to pause, to have cushion, and to use evidence when you're dealing with your people. As you look ahead, what skills or mindsets will define great leaders in the next decade?
Well, a lot of the same. And there's some of these principles that I haven't mentioned. One of them is one of my favorites is be sympathetic with the other person's ideas and desires.
I like that.
Desires are changing based on what is happening in the world. So, if I'm thinking about that phrase, be sympathetic to the other person's ideas and desires in, I don't know, let's say 1960, right? So their desires at that point are, okay, maybe I'm a veteran of World War II and I just had my first child and really I want the white picket fence, right? I mean, that was the American dream right there. And so, how can I help this person get into that, mode? And I'm not saying people today don't want the white picket fence, but if you think about, kind of what success looks like today, and we need to use these things and be sympathetic to what these people's desires are. Try honestly to see things from the person's point of view. Let the other person do a great deal of talking. You have to allow the exchange with people. And I think that's going to be really effective. One of the things that we really haven't touched on here, and I know we're talking about work and we're talking about leadership and you're talking about people losing their jobs. One of the hardest things to do that I've seen since really embracing these Dale Carnegie principles is using them with the people that are closest to me, right? So like my daughters, my wife, my better friends, right? And so I tell my course participants all the time, it's almost harder to use these principles at home than it is at work. We haven't talked about principle number one. And principle number one is, interestingly enough, the only one that has a negative word in it. Principle number one is don't criticize, condemn, or complain. So don't criticize, condemn, or complain. It starts with the word don't. All the other principles are do this, do that, make sure you do this, make sure you do that. But that's number one. And think about that with regard to the people that are closest to you. Like, don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Like, oh my God, I mean, it's not that I'm criticizing my daughters, but like, complaining about people or having a complaint or criticizing, it's really, really tough to do when you're very close to people. And so, I think I might have gone off on a little tangent there, but I really think, you mentioned the word empathy, okay, that's fine, but how do I be empathetic? Principles that have stood the test of time, right? And so there's that. One of the things that I've been talking a lot about in my talks and in my classes is motivation. I've had a couple of talks recently where motivation was the topic. And I feel that people get motivation from different places. If you are motivated to do something, that means you have the tools to do it, right? So if I'm going to build a shed, if I don't have the right tools, lumber is going to just sit there, right? I need to have the right tool. If I have a saw that's really not the right saw, then I'm probably just going to be like, you know what, I'm just not going to do it, right? So, and if I think about like going to a networking event, if I don't have the mental tools in my head to go to this networking event, the things that we teach in the Dale Carnegie class, there's a very good chance that I'm going to be like, I'm too tired. I'm not going to go to, you don't have the motivation. So, I believe that if you embrace either the Dale Carnegie principles or some set of principles and you embrace them like we're talking about, then you have the tools. And if you have the tools, you're going to be motivated. So if I have a challenging thing, if I have to lay people off, or if we're heading towards that kind of thing, I, as a leader, I may really avoid these conversations until the last minute, which is disastrous, right? But if I have the tools, I'm going to be more motivated to act on it. And in my world, the tools are the principles.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about what you said there and what I'm taking away is that empathy in the next decade is going to have to be something that leaders tap into. I'm also hearing you say, and I think I can remember this when I was teaching leadership, probably very strongly at Bloomberg. We used to talk a lot about, you have your work self and your home self. And it never really resonated with me. It never really made a lot of sense, but yet we did it because we were certified to teach it that way. And so we did. Mm-hmm. But I think more and more, and I think this is going to become true 10 years from now, is it's going to be really hard to divide yourself into pieces. And so really the beauty of these principles really is about ownership of these principles and just way you live in the way you live your life. And I love this factor of like how you're the same with your daughters, as you are in your work life. I think it puts less stress on you thinking, I'm in work mode, I'm in home mode, I'm in personal time mode, building a shed, whatever. What if you just, tap into these principles or tap into your strengths as a leader, period. And that just shows up in your everyday life and it feels a little bit more natural. And so I'm taking,
and I'm sorry, I just cut you off. I apologize.
Yeah, no worries.
This just popped into my head. We were at a social event last week and, I fancy myself a bit of a connector. One of the things that thrills me the most is saying, hey, this friend, you should really meet this friend. I love doing that. I love inviting people to personal things, right? So that gives me great joy. One of the principles I've already mentioned, number 28, give the person a fine reputation to live up to. I love using that in my personal world because if I say, hey, Jason Morrison wrote 2 books, like you should absolutely meet this person. And, he's super interesting. And I mean, you can not literally, but I mean, I almost literally can feel the energy coming off of this person, this positive energy, because I am, saying these words. It's not just like, hey, meet Jason, right? I mean, Jason wrote 2 books. He was in the Marines. He did this thing, and he's an incredible person. You absolutely have to talk to them. I mean, that is my leadership in practice off the clock. And if I'm doing that off the clock, I'm absolutely doing that on the clock. And, I mean, how is that going to benefit me in the long run? I don't know. And frankly, I don't care. If I know that I'm living these principles, somewhere down the road, there's got to be some karma. If you believe in karma, if you believe in acting in the right way that's going to benefit you in the future, then it's going to happen. I don't know if Jason is going to remember me 3 years from now and be like, oh my God, here's an opportunity for Ken. Maybe that'll happen. Great. But, you can't dictate that. You can't stress about that. But if you do it and can do it consistently, only good things are going to happen.
If you could distill the future of leadership into one principle, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think the one that's probably most important, given where we are in the world, right? I mean, so given the geopolitical issues and given AI and all these things, one of the principles that Dale Carnegie has out there, and again, I've said it already in this discussion, is if you are wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically, right? And so if I think about the world and I think about the fact that we're all the smartest people in the world because of AI and there's political division and there's different opinions and everybody's so sure of themselves these days, think about a world in which everybody is very apt to say, I was wrong, and here's why I was wrong, and I'm absolutely going to think differently. Like, how hard is that, right? But, ultimately, if we approach that, if we, 10 years from now, if I have, my watch is speaking directly into my brain from AI, ultimately, whatever's happening 10 years from now,
Yeah.
everyone in the world is not going to admit they're wrong, right? So
Right.
what a terrible thing that will be. I think,
Yeah.
empathy and humility is what we are going to need
Yes.
in the future world where we have things telling us all the time, this is absolutely the truth. We're still human beings. We can still perceive things incorrectly. And if we are incorrect, we need to say it. And that's going to make the world a better place.
I actually think that's a really good answer because I don't think people will believe as much. So if
Mhm.
you're always a person who's leading with the truth, I think that's a good principle to have. You've led through high stake moments in the Navy and corporate boardrooms and now through Dale Carnegie. What's one moment that reshaped how you define your own leadership?
So this is actually going to go way back. And I love the fact that you use the word define, right? Because again, I hate to make this sound like an advertisement for our course, but our Dale Carnegie course, our flagship course, literally the first talk that we have our participants do is called the defining moment. That's the first day of our 3-day class. It's the second version of our 8-week class. And it's the first time that these participants literally walk up in front of the class, potentially strangers, and give a talk using the magic formula, the 2 minutes. It's called the defining moment. And so what we ask people to do is reflect on what you just asked me, right? What was that moment that, speaks to you even now and says, I can do this because I did that? And so my defining moment was this, the example that I give, and this is obviously a true story from my life. I was in the Navy, and this was during Desert Storm. I'm kind of dating myself here, but during one of the conflicts, the Iraq-Kuwait conflict, and I was in communications. That was my job, and lucky for me, I had a top secret security clearance, so I actually can't tell much of the story. But I will say that there was a case where our kind of newfangled equipment went down, and we had to use kind of old time equipment to communicate, and we had a battle group of 5 ships. And so at that moment, our ship just happened to be kind of the lead communication ship. I was 19 years old, and this all happened. And thankfully for training, we knew what we had to do. I was kind of leading the Radio Shack at that moment. And I called our senior chief right away. We need to do that. And he's like, all right, handle it. And he hung up. And I picked the phone back up again. I was like, no, like, you need to come here and do this. And he said, no. I mean, this was a real emergency in my brain. And he basically said, no, you're good. And he hung up again. And, and I don't know if he was kind of freaking out because this was a bit of an unusual circumstance, but I thought, okay. And, I'm 19 years old. I'm in charge of these 5 people. 3 years before, I was cruising around the mall, with long hair and, ripped jeans. And here I am in the middle of the Red Sea. And I handled it. And I was in charge of not only our ship, but 5 other ships. And, half hour later, emergency over, problem solved. But that moment taught me that I can, right? I absolutely can, right? It taught me a lot about training and being prepared and accountability, but more than anything else, it taught me that I can.
No, I
That
love
is
it.
that is my defining moment that I talk about still in my Dale Carnegie classes, and I encourage others. And Allison, someday I'd love to hear your defining moment from your life. Talk about that someday.
What's really interesting about that also is your leader, in essence, empowering you. And sometimes you are thrown off. It sounded like at the moment, at first you're like, wait, are you okay? Because you need to come and fix this. And he was just like, no, you got it. And sometimes that's all you really need is to, whether you feel really confident in the person or not, sometimes you don't have a choice. You have to empower people. So, really nice story. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So when everything feels uncertain, how do you ground yourself as a leader?
Well, the human relations aspect of my life is very human. I am blessed to have people in my life that I can lean on. I will be very transparent here. I've been working with the Dale Carnegie organization for several years, but the ownership is relatively new in the grand scheme of the 112 years of Dale Carnegie. I'm one of the newest franchise owners. And so there is absolutely moments that are very daunting for me. Interestingly enough, I love the class, I love the training, I love facilitating, but there's a lot of things like taxes and regulations and payroll, things like that. And honestly, I mean, sometimes I'll talk to my business partner, my VP of operations, who also happens to be my wife. And so we are business partners. And I'm very proud to say that I have one of the most grounded, one of the most intelligent people about 30 feet away across the hall here that I can go and say, I'm having a panic attack and please walk me off the ledge. I also am extremely proud of I mentioned before, I have three daughters. They're in their 20s. And, you know, people say that the youth of today, right, they can't communicate and they can't be trusted or, whatever. But honestly, I don't buy into that at all.
I don't either.
I think that my 20-year-olds are some of the most grounded, intelligent, and communicative people I know. I have a team of 8 folks here in Nevada. One of my new best friends is one of my Dale Carnegie trainers. His name is Rodney Dietrich, and he's a Dale Carnegie trainer. And I can depend on him for sure. That's my answer, right? I have these people that I can count on. And it's all human relations. If I'm using these principles, if I'm giving them a fine reputation to live up to emphatically, then they're going to reciprocate and have my back.
Mm-hmm. Surrounding yourself with people who help you do what you do, but also help you expand and hold you accountable. I think as a way that I would sort of also sum up what you said, your wife and your family and your friends look to you, but they also know what you're capable of and would only expect that you're being truthful and honest at all times. So I really love that one. If leaders listening today remember only one thing about what truly matters in leadership, what would you want that to be?
If I can encapsulate all of these things, just know it could be Dale Carnegie, John Maxwell, it could be, some sort of thing that you kind of made up that you feel is near and dear to you, a set of steps, a set of values. Practice these things. I'll refer to the Dale Carnegie ones. There's 30 human relations principles. They are not necessarily easy. I say, yeah, that's common sense, but is it common practice? No. Mm-hmm. Assess and reassess and revisit your values and principles, and really constantly look at yourself and saying, am I living by these principles?
Yeah.
I'll use that quote from my friend's book again: let your principles, not the circumstance, guide your behavior. So, think about the last week, think about the last month. Did my circumstance change the way I behave because I was in a moment of stress? And if it did, I revisit how you can change that.
Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work with Dale Carnegie?
I guess the easiest way is dalecarnegie.com or nevada.dalecarnegie.com. If you're not in the state of Nevada, feel free to put the Nevada in front there, nevada.dalecarnegie.com. You'll be directed to our page and there's a contact form there. I assume my name is going to be somewhere spelled out correctly. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn.
That was awesome. I really enjoyed this conversation, Ken, and I thought there was a lot of honest reflection I was having as I was listening to you and talk about the principles and bringing the principles into real conversation. So I just want to thank you for being on the podcast. It's getting out there and people are connecting with us in real amazing ways. And so if there was just one last thought, Ken, that you would want to leave people with, is there anything that you'd want to frame, or you feel like you've said?
No, I feel like I've said what I want to say, but I appreciate you because, and this may sound a little strange, but I consider this a bit of a religion. I'm actually not a very religious person, in full transparency, but I consider a lot of this very much like a religious kind of endeavor. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure that the world knows about these kinds of things. I want to live in a world where every human being has taken the Dale Carnegie course. Because if that is the world that we're living in, then everybody's going to have empathy. Everyone's going to be living these principles, and leadership and communication is just going to be flowing so beautifully. So that's my mission.
If this episode was helpful, or you have someone that's in your life that could benefit from Dale Carnegie's program and these principles, please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. As always, lead with clarity, change with clarity, allow yourself to lean into your experiences, and you will see what will come out. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Leadership Rewired with Allison Allen. If today's episode hit home, share it with a leader who needs it. And if you want more truth talk leadership insights, subscribe wherever you listen, follow me on LinkedIn, and keep leading with clarity even when it's hard. See you next time.